Uplift, Conversations with Visionaries, is an inspiring interview series showcasing the journeys of successful entrepreneurs who not only excel in their fields, but also use their success as a force for positive change. It's another episode of Uplift, Conversations with Visionaries. I have Rob with us. He is a beautiful soul with quite a story. Now, I know we're not going to have time to get deep into all of your stories, Rob, but I'm so grateful for the opportunity to share you with our audience today. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So, high points, low points, we all have them. I know that you've had them, and I know you're going to share a little bit of your journey with us today. Let's start with the high point. Why don't you share with us one of your greatest accomplishments, something that you feel incredibly proud of?
Well, I would say one of my greatest accomplishments is not really a business accomplishment, but a personal one. My wife and I retired when I was 42 years old, and we bought a sailboat, and we went on to spend the next 17 years of our life sailing around the world. And we spent about the first 7 years in the Caribbean sailing there, and then we got enough bravery and experience to tackle sailing around the world, which took us a further 10 years. And so having a goal that is that big, that actually maintains you for 10 years, or in this case, 17 years, is quite unusual. Most of the goals I had set in my life were things I could accomplish in a shorter period of time. And so tackling something that big, and then the experience of sailing, completing that circle of where, for sailors, it's where you cross your original track. So when we came back to the Caribbean, having sailed all the way around the earth, the feeling of accomplishment is kind of indescribable. Certainly, I had never felt the same thing in other big accomplishments of my life, having spent that long on a single endeavor. And of course, over 10 years, you change. We met thousands of people around the world. We lived with different tribes of people in over 100 different countries. But what we had done as we sailed around the world was actually study the science of human happiness, what created happiness and fulfillment for ourselves, and what created happiness for fulfillment in so many different countries, to, very sophisticated countries like maybe being in the Mediterranean on the French Riviera, or being with barefoot villagers in Panama or Fiji or Tonga, and the things that were universal in all of us that created human happiness. So that was really our one of a big accomplishment for us.
It's difficult to even imagine what that would be like. And I'm sure others who are listening are also a little bit awestruck, trying to put yourself into that type of scenario. And for someone who is listening, who feels like they're embarking on a big goal, it's big to them. And sometimes we can sometimes we can question, like, am I making the right decision? Am I out of my flippin' mind? Right? I'd imagine there probably were a couple of times on your literal journey where you questioned, certain things. This is the perfect segue to my second question. So perhaps you can share with us one of your lower points in life, some challenge or adversity that kind of knocked you off your pedestal, so to speak, and caused you to really evaluate at a deeper level the journey that you are on.
Certainly. Well, as a businessman, I can have no end of stories of business failures, but your podcast would have to be 8 hours long to do that. So I'll talk about a personal failure or challenge that we faced. A number of years ago, my wife and I were on a backcountry ski trip to a cabin deep in the Colorado mountains. And partway there, the weather changed dramatically, turned into a whiteout blizzard, became the storm of the century. And we were lost for 5 days in the wilderness. We were unable to find the cabin. The storm became massive and was being reported all across the country. And when the news media heard about the lost skiers, the story went viral, and millions of people around the country were, like my parents, following the hourly news reports. And on day 3, the sheriff said that we couldn't have survived 2 nights in the blizzard. And by day 5, the sheriff announced they were giving up the search for us and they would recover our frozen bodies the following spring. And that same afternoon, we actually did get out of the mountains. We made contact with the rescue team and got out of the mountains. My parents were able to watch that live on the news along with everybody else. And the first phone call I received was from the President of the United States calling to congratulate us on our perseverance and our survival. And so we thought we had just overcome a giant challenge ahead of us. We'd been lost for those 5 days. We didn't have any tents. We didn't have enough sleeping bags. And we had survived. But my wife's feet were frozen solid. They were coal black and they were hard as a rock. So, as elated as we were to get out of the wilderness, we were nowhere out of the wilderness of reality. And on the third day that my wife was in the hospital, the doctors came to me and they told me they were going to have to amputate both of her feet. And then they said they would wait a few days and do a second surgery and amputate all of her fingers as well. And I went home that night and I collapsed on the floor of our home. I happened to see, as I walked in the door, I saw a pair of my wife's running shoes. And when I did, I just collapsed on the floor and kept looking at those shoes that she would never, ever wear again. And I lay there all night long, just crying uncontrollably, wondering what kind of life would be ahead of us with my wife having her feet and her fingers amputated. And it was clearly the lowest moment of my life. This morning, when the sun came shining in the window, I actually jumped up and I got in my car and I raced to the hospital. And I told my wife she was going to have a complete recovery. And from that moment onward, that's all both of us focused on, was a complete recovery. And a couple hours later, the doctors came in to prep her for the surgery to amputate her feet and her fingers. And we refused to sign those papers authorizing the amputation. And we just decided to see if the same optimism and resilience that had gotten us out of the wilderness would lead to a positive outcome here. And what had happened there when I lay on the floor, but is in the middle of the night, I finally fell asleep and my subconscious mind took over and it decided to be optimistic and resilient. And so that optimism and resilience have been a part of my life forever. And it took a full year, but my wife did recover. We never had any amputations. And a year after that surgery, we went to Mexico for a victory celebration. Or, excuse me, a year after they wanted to amputate, we went to Mexico for a victory celebration. My wife was dancing in the sand on the beach, and she had 2 feet and 10 fingers and 9.5 toes.
I'm so grateful that you finished the story. I was going to ask you, and I was going to say, I normally don't do this, but we're all on the edge of our seat. And that's why you're a professional speaker, because you're so captivating. And I mean, who has these kind of stories, right? Not many of us have these kind of stories. But it's such a beautiful, beautiful, it's a beautiful story because we forget that we are incredibly powerful. And in the midst of when shit literally is hitting the fan in our life, and everybody else has given up all faith because, I mean, after all, be realistic, right? In business, we're always talking about resilience and we're always talking about perseverance. We're always talking about persistence, but so many people don't understand what that really means. And when I have someone who comes on any of my podcasts and they talk about how business really is a spiritual journey, this is what they're referring to. They're referring to what's inside of us, not just the goals, not just the big house or the status, but who we become. And sometimes we have to go through hell to fully surrender enough so that we can regain that inner strength, which is what you've so beautifully articulated, that your wife was dancing, right? She was dancing on those feet that someone else would have taken away from her because they didn't have the belief.
Absolutely.
Okay. I knew this was going to be a good episode, Rob.
Yeah, the strategy that I teach is very much what you just said. It's your heart for knowing your purpose and making sure that the things you do are aligned with your purpose. And it's your head for having that optimistic and resilient mindset that leaders need. And then it's your hands for taking the actions that leaders take. And I break each of those down into the specific ways that I have learned them. And my previous career, I was a documentary filmmaker, and I filmed all kinds of high achievers, from world-class athletes to Fortune 500 CEOs to several US presidents. And I learned these leadership strategies from them. And that's what I share. It's not stuff I knew until I learned it from some of the best people in the world.
So now, this is a natural transition to my third and final question. So you set it up perfectly. How are you now that you're on the other side of so much of the adversity, as well as the incredible accomplishments? And obviously, you're still very much on your journey. How are you paying it forward? How are you giving back?
Well, as I said, I retired when I was 42, and we spent 17 years sailing around the world. And then after we finished that, we came back to the States, and I still was retired. I've been retired since then. Um, and I guess it was about 10 or 12 years after we had gotten back. I woke up every morning deciding whether I would go skiing or mountain climbing or biking or uh, doing the things that I love to do. But during the pandemic, I realized how I was watching these TV interviews with people who were sitting at home. They were no longer on the hamster wheel of their job, and they were examining their life, many of them for the first time, and realizing they were so unhappy with the lives they were leading. And I knew I had a strategy to help do change that for people. We had given back in other ways. As we sailed around the world, we started a scholarship fund, and we put 29 kids through college. So we had given back in other ways. But during the pandemic, when I realized how many people were so dissatisfied with the lives they were leading, and I knew I had lived an incredible life and I had strategies for how I could share that with other people. That's when I started my speaking business during the pandemic. And so now I get up on stage in front of thousands of people a year, and I share these strategies. I work with businesses. I teach the science of human happiness, but the way it applies to a business is when your employees are happier, they're engaged employees. So I combat burnout, and in the workplace, I promote engagement by teaching the strategies I do. And then the other talks and workshops that I do are on leadership. So I teach these leadership strategies of resilient leadership. And again, it's not, when I talk about resilience, it's not something I read in a business book. It's this lived experience of being given up for dead. When I talk about leadership, it's not something that I did myself. It's what I learned from these super high achievers, Fortune 500 CEOs, US presidents. And then when I talk about adapting, the third part of leadership is being adaptable. We've been through a pandemic. AI is now turning our businesses on its head. We don't know what's coming next, but something is. And when you're a sailor and the winds and seas are constantly changing, you learn to constantly adapt to the new wind conditions, the new wave conditions. You still have to consult your compass and your purpose and get to your goal, but you maybe have to use new strategies. So I teach how to think like a sailor in your business environment so that you can adapt to changing times. So that's how I'm giving back now.
I love it. You are amazing, Rob. For anyone who is listening to this episode, I have an episode that we did on the Mind of Business Success podcast a while back, so they can find that on the YouTube channel. And then I think we're going to have you back, aren't we? Do we have you booked for that yet?
I don't think we have me booked, but I'd be happy to come
Okay.
back.
Well, we're going to have him back on the Mind of Business Success podcast also because we can't get enough of you, Rob. So
Thank you
thank you
so
so
much.
much for being with us on Uplift Conversations with Visionaries. You are an inspiration.
Thank you so much for having me.
And thank you to everyone who is tuned into this episode. I hope you know that we are doing this for you. If you haven't already subscribed, make sure you do so because these are incredible visionary entrepreneurs that are coming on each week, full of inspiration for all of us, myself included. So thank you, everyone.